We finished last week of the Lori Vallow Daybell trial with some fiery testimony there in court. And so we were anxious to get into week 2. A bit more technical today, right, Erica?
Yeah, Andrea, as you said, the courtroom was packed again today, more so than I think the end of last week. And I think people are really clamoring to get a spot inside, especially because we have seen some bombshell testimony, including Lori Vallow Daybell's own brother testifying against her, and Kay Woodcock, Charles Vallow, her husband's wife. Or her former husband, I should say. So a lot of key people have come forth so far to talk about this case. And of course, Lori Vallow Daybell is representing herself too. So I think really, people really want to see this unfold, for their own eyes, which is what I am doing in the courtroom.
And we'll talk about some of those people that were there still coming back. We saw some familiar faces, some new faces today, so we'll certainly get to that. But let's touch on what the medical examiner talked about. He was the first witness today. Felt badly. He seemed like he was a little bit nervous. Of course, he's not used to, he testifies, but this isn't his, public speaking and speaking in such a high-profile case. He spoke perfectly fine, but again, just seemed a little bit more reserved, a little bit, slower to answer some of those questions. And really it came back down to that bamboo shirt. That's still a question that Lori keeps raising in terms of how could what Charles was wearing have affected some of this evidence they've collected? How do you think that's playing with the jury?
It's hard to tell because it feels like she's kind of throwing everything she can to see what sticks to a wall when it comes to casting doubt on the state's case here. And, the Emmy, I agree with you. I think this is some of the topics we have to talk about with a medical examiner are uncomfortable because you're talking about someone who's passed and their analysis of the body of the person. And yeah, with this one, I think the two big things, he talked about were the bullet wounds. So there were 2. And to kind of set the stage here, what the state is alleging is that Lori's brother, Alex Cox, shot and killed Charles, and that Lori and Alex, her brother, conspired to do so. So he was shot twice. The medical examiner reaffirmed, as we heard from some witnesses before last week, who said, yeah, this is how it happened. This is how it would play out. That he shot him once in the chest and then another time in the abdomen after he had already fallen over, which kind of, throws away that self-defense argument there. But that's what the state is saying. That's really the groundwork they're trying to lay. But what we've seen from Lori, not just in her line of questioning last week, but now with the medical examiner, is that she's trying to not only say, are you sure he was on the ground when he was shot that second time, right, but are you sure his shirt didn't cause some of the markings here that would make you believe this? And this witness, denied that it was the shirt. He said that's really not something he sees. Although Lori followed up and said, well, have you ever done bamboo? Like, what do you know about bamboo? And he said, not really a lot, but it seems like it's a really far stretch for her to try and bring that up and to actually have a jury buy that could be a problem in this case that it didn't lay out or play out the way that the state is alleging it did.
And during this testimony, they are showing those pictures. They are showing that evidence, those injuries on Charles' body, and being very specific, right? Talking about those measurements and things. Again, very technical, and yet also being very specific and not circumstantial at all. This is the science behind where was somebody standing when they fired that weapon, how far away, and to your point, really kind of taking away that idea of self-defense. I know she questioned whether or not he could have had some of those injuries, the bruises on his knees, things like that. Could that have happened before he died? And he said, no, that's simply not the way that works, right? That you can tell there's lots of evidence that wasn't the case. And so it kind of took away that questioning. And we talked, it's interesting to watch that as soon as she kind of hits a roadblock, as soon as she seems to hit a wall, she really does change her demeanor quite dramatically. You can see her voice changes. She kind of, almost shuts down, becomes more meek. Very different than what we saw, the Lori we saw last week, when I would say she was fiery in some of her questions and almost aggressive. And so it's interesting to see that dynamic. And of course, in some of the other evidence we saw today, the video of her, I wonder if the jury's picking up on what seems to be somewhat of situational personalities, perhaps.
Yeah, I would say so. It's certainly something I'm picking up on, being in there and having covered this case for so long. You've seen so many iterations of her on camera and videos and evidence. And I totally agree with what you're seeing, Andrea, because Yeah, it seems, particularly if she maybe knows the witness from before, she's a little more testy, a little more strong-willed. But if it's someone she doesn't know, she'll kind of walk up. She's sometimes a little giggly by saying, okay, is this your correct name? Like, how do I say that? How do I pronounce that? And we've seen that throughout the day. And yeah, it's just a totally different vibe. But you can kind of see this, and the jury is seeing these changes happen in real time over the course of the day, depending on what witness is testifying or
Right.
depending on what evidence is being introduced. And I don't know. I don't know if that's a game plan for her or if she realizes that she's coming off in different ways. But I would have to imagine that the jury is 1,000% picking up on these changes.
Well, and what is interesting to me too is it is a layer of evidence, if you will. She's representing herself. Of course, if she had a defense attorney representing her, we wouldn't get to see this dynamic. In fact, we wouldn't see her interact at all, likely, unless she took the stand, which we know is very unusual. And so there is this element of, by representing herself, you're essentially putting that on the record. And that is an interesting piece, to know that that is there, even though it is not, direct testimony, but you can't unsee it, and you can't, not realize that, because of certainly the demeanor of the credibility of the prosecutor is at play when those jurors are evaluating, how they respond. And so they're going to be looking at Lori the same way. The difference is that she is the defendant herself. And so you can't help but think that that's a unique dynamic that plays into this because she has chosen to represent herself. Now, we love the insight. We like to see her thought process. I think for somebody watching the trial, trying to understand it, I think it is certainly insightful. But of course, what remains to be seen how the jury feels about it.
Yeah, and Andrea, you mentioned the prosecutor too, and I'll say, just comparing the two, because it's primarily the prosecutor who's been doing the questioning and bringing in the witnesses, and she's very calm, collected, stern. Like, I don't think she has a different mode at all. At least she hasn't shown it in the courtroom. So especially comparing her presentation to Lori's presentation, I think is also a takeaway. Not just comparing Lori to herself, but to the other person who many would probably say is presenting herself more professionally and more typical of what you would see in a courtroom. And, that was just, it's been every witness. We've seen something different, I would say.
Exactly. Yeah. So after the medical examiner, we get through that evidence, and then we get into this, really some good information about the potential motive here, because we've heard the prosecutor in the opening statement, say that this was about money. This was about greed. This was about access to that money, so that then getting Charles Vallow out of the way, so that then Lori can go and be with Chad Daybell. Of course, that is who she is married to, has been since just a couple of weeks after Charles Vallow was killed. So we got into hearing her, speaking of personalities, being able to hear her conversation on the phone as she's calling to find out about those benefits.
Yeah, and this was someone, this witness they called Special Agent Mark Sari. It's someone familiar to us because he also was part of the cases in Idaho. And when I say cases in Idaho, I mean Lori Vallow's trial in Idaho, where she was convicted of killing her children and conspiring to kill Tammy Daybell, Chad Daybell's first wife, and then Chad Daybell's trial in Idaho, where he was convicted of killing his wife, Tammy, and Lori's children, and was sentenced to death. So you think Social Security might not be that interesting, but this really is, a big part of this case here. And ultimately, what Special Agent Sari testified to today was that after Charles Vallow died, Lori Vallow and her son, JJ, were receiving benefits from the Social Security Administration. And she was getting about $4,000 a month for between her and JJ. And then we also learned that the special agent was aware that her daughter Tylee was also receiving benefits from the passing of her own father, in 2018. So she was getting a lot of money from Social Security. And what we come to learn is that this special agent was brought in to investigate whether she was committing fraud. And we could tell that the jury was really paying attention to this portion because they were able to submit some questions to the judge after his testimony concluded. Take a listen.
Were payments to Lori Vallow stopped after your investigation?
They were, yes.
And during your investigation, do you know if Lori Vallow notified Social Security of her new marriage?
She did not.
Based on those questions, did the defendant have any follow-up for this witness?
Mr. Sari, you said that I did not notify Social Security of my marriage
Correct?
that you know of.
To my knowledge, you have not? No.
Okay. So you don't know if in Hawaii I was at the Social Security office and notified them?
Sustain. It's, again,
But you're,
testifying.
so would you have all of the information from every office in that regard?
From our review of the records, there is no notification at all of you ever notifying Social Security of that marriage.
Of of the records that you had access to, is that correct?
From our review of the Social Security databases, which would encompass notifications, we have seen 0 notifications.
You can tell in those questioning, and he's not the only witness that did this today, but you can see a little bit of frustration. In fact, a couple of times we heard witnesses say, essentially, I don't know what you're asking, or I don't know how to answer this differently than I already have. And I think you see a little bit of that frustration there. I mean, clearly he's trying to say, I don't have any reason to think you notified the Social Security office. And she just keeps coming back with the questions. And like we talked about last week, sometimes there's the prosecutor will speak up and will object. Other times I think, it kind of goes for a little bit just because I think the prosecutor, part of that strategy is to recognize that this isn't helping. This is not, it's not damaging anything. And in fact, potentially, if anything, damaging the Lori's position on this. But you can see some of that frustration, I think, come out in a couple of those witnesses today.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you could also sense Lori Vallow Daybell's frustration with some of these witnesses. And this is one of those examples, Andrea, I think, where she's asking these questions and she asks some of them. I know there was a lot more to that clip that we just played for you, but she asked some questions a few different ways to try and get a different answer, it feels like. And sometimes the prosecutor will object, saying asked and answered. It really makes her look messy, as this testimony also didn't make her look good. When you have the jury wondering whether, anything came of this investigation, and he said, yep, she didn't get those benefits. And then, it's a challenge. It doesn't make her look good. So I think that's her trying to recover from, the damaging testimony that was just laid out that she really can't refute, because that's what happened. And, trying to say that, I tried to notify someone with, about Chad Daybell, but if it's not recorded, then you can't, the jury can't buy it. And it's, that was another objection too, that's part of her testimony. And we've seen that a lot with her, is that she'll try to say things or give remarks while she's asking questions. The judge will have to stop her and say, no, you can't do that. Like, you're not testifying here. So it goes to the obviously lack of experience of being an attorney in a courtroom, but just, things that the jury is definitely picking up on when she's presenting her case here.
Well, and we also know you can't, if she's going to ask the question, if there was evidence, if she had any proof that she had gone, if she had a piece of paper, if she had an application, if she had some sort of notification, that would be where we would see this. That's where a defense attorney, if they had some, evidence to refute his claim, would be able to present that and talk about, what is this? Could this have been missed? Could this have been submitted? We don't see that. We just have questions being asked, essentially just what if. Right. It's kind of like her question that she always goes back to, were you there? Did you see with your own eyes or hear with your own ears me conspire to kill my husband? I think it's the exact same form of question. You can't know. Absolutely. You can't prove what didn't happen is part of the problem with these witnesses. And in fact, that's what she's asking them to do, is to prove to me that it didn't happen, which is, of course, we know, and impossible to do.
Keep in mind too, that some of these witnesses, they were called into this case 5 years ago in some regards. So the memory, and it sounds like they've been able to use notes or reference their reports or look at videos of themselves before. And it sounds like there's been prep work on the prosecution side, but it's been a long time since a lot of these things have happened. And I think she's also been, by being Lori Vallow, she's also trying to use that to her advantage to be like, well, when did you come into the case? And it just, it doesn't, it's a tactic for sure. But again, the big question is, does it land with the jury? And, we see this with the next witness too, and again, it goes to more of the motivation, more of the money, because we hear from someone with the life insurance group that had Charles's claim, and we are able to hear 2 phone calls between her and Lori when Lori calls, in the wake of Charles's death. I believe the first time she called was maybe the July 15th, they said, checking my notes, which was only a few days after he died. And she called and said, hey, I want to make a claim. And, I'm the beneficiary. That's what she thought at the time. So we heard testimony about that too. And then we see later that she calls back again. And all these calls are recorded, whether she's aware of that or not. But I think you can also hear some of those demeanor changes when she's on the phone with someone with the life insurance, policy there. So take a listen.
So maybe that's something he just told him he was going to do. That's just a handwritten copy I have that I found. So.
Okay, so I really can't give too much information, but I can tell you that the beneficiary was changed in March of this year.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to figure out what he was doing since we have 5 kids and we've been married for 15 years.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I know he owes a lot of people money, and I was worried if I got money, they'd be coming after me for money.
Right, no, I understand that.
But now I will be with none. So, but did he change it to one person, or was it several people?
Unfortunately, I can't release that. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, I know you can't tell. We're in the business. My husband is the agent. He's the agent.
Okay.
So,
got it. Okay.
We deal with this business all the time, so I kind of know how it works, but I'm completely surprised.
Right.
We have our 7-year-old with autism that we adopted together, so I am surprised that he would do that without telling me.
I'm so sorry.
So, there's nothing you can do about that, even though it's community coverage. It's his policy.
This is a contract that we have with the insured, exactly. So he's able to make any changes, during the lifetime of the policy.
Well, can I check? I have a policy, a $2 million policy on me. And since he's the agent, would he have been able to change the beneficiary on my policy?
Not if he was the agent. He would have had to have owned the policy, but I can certainly check.
But if he would have signed my name, could he have done that? I wonder.
I don't, I would hope that wouldn't happen, but let me just pull up.
Okay, now just to be clear, that is the representative who you hear talking to Lori Vallow Daybell. There she is on the stand. That's her sitting as the courtroom and as the jury listens to that phone call and that back and forth. And as you said, you can hear Lori's frustration, clearly surprised, shocked, did not know that this had happened, did not know that change had happened, and assuming the prosecutors, they're trying to prove that she expected fully to get that life insurance policy. And in fact, that's what she was going to use to go and fund her life with Chad Daybell. And so it's interesting too, how quickly she kind of changes the conversation to, well, what else could he have done? And almost even implying that there was some fraudulent activity on his part. Could he have signed my name? Could he have changed my policy? And that's interesting, I think.
It is interesting. And I think it does give you a little bit more into the mindset of Lori, because you can tell she realizes in her view, and again, this is my perspective on this based on reporting on this case, in her view, she feels like she was wronged by Charles, because what we learn is that once he started having problems with Lori, he switched his life insurance policy to his sister Kay. So she was the one who ultimately got the payout, but Lori did not know about this. And she fully assumed, and you could hear that in the first phone call, which we, has been on our live stream. And she, says, I'm the beneficiary, and, is very confident that she's going to be getting this money. But we hear in this call, she'd been notified that she was not the beneficiary, and they can't really give her much information for privacy reasons. So she's, it almost sounds like she's trying to throw Charles under the bus after she feels like she's been wronged by him because he changed this policy, and kind of suggests that, well, and I think it's twofold, because she's trying to make her husband, Charles, who she, her brother just killed, look bad, but she's also trying to make herself appear to be a victim to maybe try and get more information out of this agent than she would typically share over the phone. And you could hear her say, well, was there one beneficiary? I think she was trying to understand, was it his sister? Was it his children? Was it who could have taken this opportunity away from me? And it was really, you could tell seeing the agent sitting on the stand, it's uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable to listen to that sort of recording. And the prosecutor follows up by saying, like, you can't share this information. Does it get awkward sometimes when you have to have these conversations with people? And she's like, yeah, it can sometimes. But this, obviously we see how the rest of this case plays out. And this looks bad. This really looks bad for her.
Well, and also on that redirect, that the prosecutor, because Lori says on the phone call, I know how this all works, right? She makes a comment about, he was an agent. We know the business. I know how this works. I know what you can and can't do. And then the prosecutor asked that agent again on redirect. It didn't seem like she really knew how this worked, did it? And she said, no, she wasn't very clear. So even that, saying, oh, I know, I understand, it's fine. But then also to the point of being the victim, it's the 7-year-old, we have a 7-year-old autistic child that we adopted together, been together for a long time. I mean, and again, this is just her kind of talk. You can hear her talking out loud about these ideas as she's probably trying to process now what, potentially if that's the way she went into that phone call, which is what the prosecutor is trying to say. That's, you can kind of hear that thought process. And then it's also interesting to me to think, she starts probably wondering, does she start wondering, now what does that mean for, if he made that decision, why did he make that decision? And what else perhaps is there that I don't know about, or that there's, where else might there be things pointing to this that Charles knew? And we heard last week that Adam Cox, her brother, and Charles both had those conversations, talked to police about, being fearful. Talk to the person that he went out on a date with. I mean, we've heard that a couple of times from a couple of different people, that he was concerned. And this furthers that fear, I think, and, potentially why he took action.
Absolutely. And you'll notice with this witness too, in particular, that, she laid it out there. She said that thing, she did answer the questions of the prosecutor saying, she didn't really know what she was talking about when it comes to insurance. And there was no follow-up. There was no cross-examination of this witness. So I think that also speaks to her strategy and demeanor in court, because this is someone who's kind of laid out a case against you. She's not had good things to say. And where do you go with that? What can you can't really twist that testimony, I would say, with a different line of questioning. So it was really, I think that was a key piece of evidence that the jury had to hear this afternoon.
Well, and these are opportunities for Lori, in her own words, on these recordings. And we saw the same thing. We got another version of Lori in those moments right after Charles Vallow was killed, shot and killed in his house. By most accounts, I think that if there had been a struggle, if there had been a fight, if this is an act of self-defense or any kind of issue, you don't expect people to be calm after that. I think most of us have an assumption about how we would respond if we were in the middle of some sort of traumatic event like that. And we heard from the detective who said they didn't seem to match perhaps what she expected of human behavior after an incident, the way they were describing it.
Yes, and this is Detective Cassandra Inklin with the Chandler Police Department. She's one of many officers who responded to Lori's rental home that day when Charles was shot. And she was not the only one to testify, not the only first responder to testify that her behavior was abnormal. It seemed off. And it's interesting because this is something, and we'll go back to her full testimony in a moment, but Lori herself, once she was able to cross-examine this witness, said, well, what's normal behavior? Do you have a psychology degree? So we got to see another sign of Lori there. And I think the detective answered by saying, no, I don't have a degree. But she said, and there's also not a standard way for people to respond when they're under stress. But she said there are things that are striking. And that is what she said of Lori Vallow's behavior, was that it was striking. And she not only witnessed Lori at the scene, but she had the opportunity to actually interview her in those moments after. And I'll kind of set the stage before we play out some of that, because this detective responded. Obviously, there's a lot of people on this scene, and she realizes that, at some point, Lori arrives at the scene, and she wasn't there to begin with. So she thinks, do I need to go notify her? Does this need to be a death notification? This woman just lost her husband. And she walks us through the moments of trying to talk to Lori in that moment and try to get her away from her daughter, Tylee, who was also there. And, she's like, can you step aside? I need to tell you this. She's like, oh, I know what happened. I was already there. That's what she testifies. So now the detective is realizing, oh, you both are witnesses. We need to interview you. And, as the day evolves, they, Tylee, Lori's daughter, Lori herself, and then Alex Cox, her brother, are all taken to the Chandler Police Department, and they're, interviewed by police. And I'm wondering what you think about, before we play some of that out, I'm wondering what you think of Lori's, the demeanor being described of Lori in this moment leading up to this time.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think the most telling thing, or the most I think probably surprising to people, is the way that she was very matter of fact and seemed to know so much more than even the people on the scene recognized. And so I think as they're piecing, she talked about piecing together, wait, what's your role and where were you? And in fact, kind of having that conversation, they went back and forth about, I thought I needed to notify you of the death, and I didn't want to do that in front of the young girl or the teenager. And then Lori, kind of almost challenged that of like, why would that be? Did you not think you were coming? Why did that change? Basically, why did that change your approach to me? And did that change your approach? And it was, again, another one of those moments in court today where it was a little confusing because I wasn't really sure where Lori was trying to go with that questioning, but other than to kind of challenge the tactics. But I think that there is, I cannot fathom a person, again, most people, we don't have to study psychology. We don't have to be experts in human behavior to recognize stress, to recognize, when you're distraught, to see how most people respond. Now, shock and certainly that can change a person's demeanor, but even not in just even the moments that right after, but in the hours that they spent at the police station and then the drive home. And we heard about, she talked about her laughing and her talking and just being very chatty. And so I think all those pieces together, you might be able to dismiss the right after a traumatic event. There are a lot of things that can happen and people can react differently. The hours afterwards to see that it's almost consistency in the calmness. I think that is what, the detective was saying. It didn't make sense.
No. And something we see too, once Lori is ultimately interviewed by this detective, is that she's actually giving the same story to this detective that she's tried to lay out in her opening statement, is that this was a self-defense issue. She didn't know why her husband, Charles, would ever be coming to her house. They weren't, they were not in a good place. And you see throughout this interview that she's giggling and laughing and, again, exhibiting this behavior that is often, quite frankly, strange and not what I would maybe expect. And again, people react differently to a bunch of different things. But to your point, Andrea, it was consistent nonchalance almost throughout every, based on all accounts of people who have testified. And I think it's worth for people to see themselves. So please take a listen.
Right. So I kissed JJ goodbye. He came back in and his phone was on the counter and I had his phone. And he was like, giving me my phone. And I was like, why don't you show me your text that you've been texting, blah, 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 whatever. Because he's like acting really weird, like he's plotting something against me. Like, I'm like, why are you even here? Like, what did you come here for? He's been talking to my other brother, and my brother came into town at the same time last night. And I haven't talked to my brother in a while, my other brother. And I was like, and so he was texting him on the phone when he first got to my house. And I'm like, why are you texting Adam? Like, do you even talk to him? Like, my other brother.
So when she talked to you, she told you that she had wanted Alex to be there sort of to protect her in case anything went bad, right?
Correct.
So did she tell you why Alex didn't go to the door with her when Charles is pounding on the door being a jerk or whatever?
She did not.
So she didn't explain why the gun was there or why Alex wasn't part of this initial phone argument?
Correct.
Did Lori ever tell you during your interview that Charles started this argument?
No.
during your interview of Lori Vallow, was it always her saying that it was her that started this argument because she would not give Charles back his phone?
Correct.
Now, of course, we know, let's back up a little bit. We heard last week, Charles was there, according to everyone that he had talked to leading up to that, talking to Adam, talking to the woman he had gone out on a date with. He was there to pick up JJ and take him to school because he had not seen JJ. He was, we heard testimony that he was excited, giddy, I think is the word that they used to describe how excited he was. And so that also is interesting, that certainly is not at all the stories that now we know, now being told about his demeanor and, and his level of engagement. And in fact, you remember, in terms of being angry and being aggressive, in everything that we have seen, whether it's Charles Vallow talking to police, Adam, his interactions with Adam, the woman mentioned that, he was very, kind of kind and very, seemed relatively relaxed, despite they talked about fear, they talked about him being upset, but we haven't heard any testimony about him being aggressive or angry or, lashing out in any way. So that also is striking to me, that that's how this is described, because we've heard that or seen that nowhere else.
No, it's only been from Lori. And then we also hear it, and it'll be interesting. I don't think some of this will be played in court, but we know there were 3 interviews conducted that day at the Chandler Police Department between her brother Alex and then her daughter Tylee, who was also interviewed. And they both gave some version of Charles came out. Charles was the aggressor, but we know that both Alex and Tylee are dead and they cannot speak for themselves or say what, led up to their interview process at that time. So it's, the jury doesn't see that, but just to kind of lay more foundation for our viewers to, you're right. We've only heard this version from people on Lori's side of this, I would say. And
right.
It's interesting because, and this came up in some of the cross-examination and some of the discussion after the fact, is that Lori wasn't being interviewed as a suspect that day. She was, kind of being treated as a victim, according to the detective. And still, Lori came back after, with a line of questioning that I think was pretty pointed towards this detective. And it shows, her frustration and, were you doing the right thing? How dare you let my daughter sit in a room? Did you think to bring a gun in front of my daughter as you're questioning her? And the detective is like, well, no, this is pretty standard. And your daughter's older. It seems like, again, she's just trying to throw whatever she can at the wall and see what may stick with the jury. And yeah, it's a tactic that remains to be seen if this will work here. But yeah, of course, that interview and, kind of the discussion and questioning that came after it, I think we, back up a little bit further too to this phone fight. And just to remind people that Lori was saying that she had Charles's phone inside and that he was coming after her for it. So that is kind of the impotence of this aggression, according to Lori. And I thought it was really interesting that the prosecutor kind of circled back to that to say, well, wait a minute, Lori never told you that Charles was the one who started this fight. She was the one who had the phone. And why didn't she just turn the phone over? That could have, diminished the threat, so to speak, that Charles was presenting. Why did it have to? I think what she was trying to get at was, why did it need to unfold to this point where your daughter brings out a bat and your brother brings out a gun and everyone's fighting and now Charles is dead? It doesn't add up when you put together all the other testimony with what Lori is saying. And I know, Andrea, we heard a lot of snippets of this interview, and I'm curious to know what you thought about the portion we played for people was actually one of the longer ones. And I thought some of the ways they broke it up was a bit jarring. So I'm curious to know what you thought about the presentation of this interview.
Yeah, and as it happened, I was listening to it and thinking, and of course, Lori did, the defense to her, she did on her behalf challenge that and asked that the entire interview be played. She did reference a rule 106, that says you can't play snippets, that needs to be played in full. But the judge, of course, did clarify that afterwards. And really that rule is designed to keep you from playing things out of context. So you can't take sections, piece them together, and try to change the meaning. He made sure to say that the way that rule is interpreted, it does not mean that you can't play portions of an interview. The other thing I think that comes into play, that we have seen the full interview, so we know what's there. But the prosecutor has to be very careful, as we've talked about. It's the same reason that they have to make sure the question that is asked is the only question that's answered. Because I think that in some of these portions of this interview, they would potentially be bringing in information that was either hearsay, because she's going to be talking about perhaps, what Tylee's experience was, or maybe what Alex's experience was. And I think the judge has been very careful. And I think the prosecutor is essentially being just very conservative and making sure to not introduce anything that could be on appeal or any other place, could damage the credibility here. So I agree that it's jarring, but I also think that it's jarring in a sense of it doesn't tell the whole story. I don't think it takes away, though, from what they're trying to show. And that is, again, her demeanor, her laughing, to show the way that she answers the questions. I think in that way, the prosecutor's probably getting exactly what she wanted out of this.
Yeah. And I would say, to your point about, why the judge continued to allow this despite Lori's several objections, was that they didn't take anything out of context. This was all very much, It felt like the prosecutor was laying out, here's what you're going to hear, and then the jury heard it. And then here's what you're going to hear next, and the jury heard it. So it did seem very methodical. And to go back to our point that we were discussing earlier, is that you're right. The prosecutor is being very careful not to bring in hearsay and, put up forward a very clean case here, especially because so much is at stake. Whereas, again, we don't see that same carefulness from Lori in a lot of ways, who often brings in, often tries to ask questions that could be considered hearsay, and, gets her own testimony in there, whether she's trying to do it or not. And I think it just, again, shows the difference between the prosecution's case and the way Lori is conducting herself. Of course, we haven't gotten to the point yet where she could, is presenting her own case, but we've seen so far her line of questioning has been, a bit scattered and all over the place in a lot of different ways.
Well, and I was actually curious to know why she even made that objection, because I can't imagine that she would prefer the whole interview be played, meaning I don't think that benefits her at all.
No, I don't think so either. And the only thing I could think of, because again, we've had the ability to review this whole this whole clip, and there was maybe one point, if I remember, where she, the detective leaves her and she's sitting there alone. And I recall maybe she grabbed a tissue at one point. So perhaps that would have been in a place where it could have contradicted, I wasn't emotional about, my husband, but it wasn't that strong of a moment from it, my recollection of watching that through. And I, looked through my notes again too from, reporting once that video was released by the Chandler Police Department in 2021. And I feel like the prosecutor picked the strongest moments out of all of that and really put them forth in court today.
Familiar faces back in the courtroom. Colby was there. Colby Ryan, Lori's oldest son. You said today we talked earlier, they saw each other, or she looked at him. You saw that interaction today? Yeah.
So once we came back from the lunch break, Colby has been sitting right in the front of the courtroom. And just to lay the scene out again for folks, it's, the defense table if you're looking forward towards the judge, the defense is on the left, the prosecution is on the right. Then there's a gallery all behind it, media in the back row, and then jury off to the far right. So that's the layout. And Colby, her son, has been sitting front and center in that very first row. And he first showed up last week and we were able to talk to him. He said, obviously, this was hard to watch, not just his mother doing this, but to watch other people he's become close with throughout this whole horrific ordeal that his family's gone through. Hard to watch them have to testify and relive this. And what was really interesting to me today is that Lori Vallow Daybell came back from lunch. She's walking in to the courtroom. And once Colby goes and sits down, she's turned around and I saw her smile at him, kind of like didn't have teeth. It was just kind of like a smile toward her son. And from my vantage point and anyone's vantage point, you couldn't see, and the jury was not in the room at this point. You couldn't see Colby react, but she, stared at him for a few seconds to make it seem like maybe he had seen her. I don't know how he would have reacted. And obviously his relationship with his mother is completely, it's not ever what it once was, because she's been convicted of killing his siblings. So it's, and he's spoken on his own platforms and in interviews that obviously this is hard. This is so hard. But it was interesting for her to kind of show that demeanor. Again, we see that because it did seem, at least to me, and again, I'm not her, I'm not Colby, I didn't get to talk to Colby about this, but she smiled and it looked like, it almost seemed like a loving smile. And I don't think we've seen that charisma from her in the courtroom so far, or really in any other interviews we've seen. So it was truly an interesting moment. And I'm curious to know how you think about that before we get into some other people. Right. Yeah.
Just a little moment of humanity that you hope that, like I said, maybe that is real, and maybe that is still at the heart of some of this stuff. And Ray Hermosillo from Idaho, also in the courtroom today, which is a new face that you haven't seen before.
No, not in the courtroom. And he's not there to testify. He's now a lieutenant with the Rexburg Police Department up in Idaho. And he, was one of the first people on this case up on that end of things. And he and another investigator were there. They came down from Idaho, and we were able to talk to him outside court after things wrapped up today. And, we were asked, why did you come down here? And he's like, well, twofold. I want to be here to support Colby and Kay, referring to Charles Vallow's sister, Kay Woodcock, who, originally raised the flag on the kids being missing and kind of got this case, got the ball rolling to what we now know as the full scope of this case. And, he said he felt it was important to be there to support them because he's gotten to know them over these past 5+ years. And it's a bit surreal. And from his vantage point, watching her represent herself, her being Lori Vallow Daybell, he said he knows Lori. He's investigated her before. Right. And he said this wasn't this, it was pretty much in line with what he would expect out of her. So those were his two takeaways before he let him go. He said he was going to be here tomorrow too, but we'll plan to probably head back to Idaho after that. So of course, I can imagine as an investigator being involved in something like this. This isn't one of those cases you ever forget about. So it makes sense to me that we're seeing people like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case that has pulled people, strangers from international attention, but then also equally there's that group of people, we know that the former juror, the alternate juror that was there for her first trial, Tom Evans comes and watches, writing a book about it. So you've seen this, essentially a community that has formed around this case, all with kind of different parts, different roles to play, some very connected, like the Kay and Larry Woodcock, Colby Ryans, and then some of these people that are investigators that you don't often see the intermingling, if you will, and yet they are absolutely a part of a community that has been together and have supported each other, as you've pointed out, for years, and likely probably will continue to stay connected. I think they've talked about that, is that they've made, through this tragedy, they've made lifelong friends and really found support in each other. And so it's interesting to see how they show up for each other, literally.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of what we can expect heading into tomorrow, we expect Cassandra Inklin, the detective with Chandler Police, she'll continue being on the stand. Lori will continue her cross-examination, and we'll see what maybe comes out of that. But something that came up today, the judge asked, maybe during one of the breaks or heading into something, what do you think is your timeline to finish your case in chief? He's asking the prosecutor, and she said Thursday. So we're, this is theoretically possibly the last week of witnesses from the state, which I was surprised to hear. I thought, I didn't know if we were moving fast or slow in this process, especially with Lori Vallow's cross-examination of many witnesses. That's kind of like been a slower process. But I'm wondering if, the grand witness list that they, had to present to the defense, it sounds like they may not get to everybody who's listed there ultimately. So I guess we'll see ultimately at the end of this case in chief who they call, who they don't, and maybe what gaps, we think might be there based on what we've covered. So I'm really curious to see, but it sounds like things are moving at a faster pace than expected as well.
And they predicted what they said, 4 to 6 weeks potentially that this case could go. And so, of course, we still have lots more. Lori will have an opportunity to bring witnesses in. Her list is also long. Many of them, though, we heard going into this trial had not been subpoenaed, so we didn't expect that list to be accurate in terms of, we certainly didn't expect most of the people on that list to be called. It seemed as if in those initial hearings, she was essentially making a what-if list just in case. She talked a lot about, having people on foundation and things. So it'll be interesting to see who she calls, if anyone. Will there be a bamboo shirt expert? Will there be somebody to,
I don't think anyone has, I don't think anyone's been subpoenaed in that regard. But that did come up briefly today. I know before we go, Andrea, that, it seems like she also discussed the challenges in, putting on a defense from her position being incarcerated at the Estrella jail here in Phoenix. And we just learned today there was a bit of a hearing before we started our afternoon testimony regarding some of the motions that, she filed. And it turns out that some of the subpoenas she sent out kind of were, sent out later than things had been resolved in court, including one to Brandon Boudreaux, who is the victim of her second conspiracy case, or the alleged victim, I should say, here in Arizona. And then it sounded like one of Charles Vallow's brothers. And she said, no, those went out later. We had stricken them. So there's been some, changes to her witness list. And we are still seeing some of that play out in court. And I think some of these people might be a game time decision of, can they talk, can they not? Especially this expert she wants to bring in, for cell phone analysis. So it'll be really interesting to see what's coming down the pipeline. Absolutely.
The prosecutor certainly did, on the record multiple times, make it very clear that we have the right to talk to them and to know what's going to be presented. So whether or not she followed the rules of the court and whether or not those will be allowed to be witnesses, that will be what we will remain to see. Of course, it all plays out inside the courtroom, which is where Erica will be again tomorrow. And we will be back here tomorrow night to break it all down. So we hope to see you then.